Okay, so let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today, looking at these sources you sent over, all centering on Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, specifically a speech he gave recently.
That's right. And the setting was, well, pretty interesting. Princeton University, 50 years after he graduated himself.
Right, but it sounds like it wasn't just, a nostalgic trip. The sources are pretty clear this was Powell defending the Fed's actions, especially around the pandemic response.
Exactly. And the source frames this defense against what it calls onslaughts of attacks.
Right.
So there's definitely some tension there.
Onslaughts of attacks. And they name names, right. President Trump and former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh are mentioned specifically in the material you provided.
Correct.
So I think our mission here is clear. Let's dig into what Powell actually defended, what these specific criticisms are according to your sources, and sort of what this whole back and forth tells us about the economic conversation right now.
Sounds good. Where should we start? Powell's defense.
Yeah, let's start there. What were the main actions Powell was highlighting in his speech, the ones he felt needed defending?
Well, he really zeroed in on two big things the Fed did when the pandemic hit hard. First, slashing interest rates.
The benchmark rate, right, taking it down to basically zero.
Pretty much zero, yeah. Which, aims to make borrowing money really cheap, get things moving.
Standard crisis response, in a way. And the second thing?
Second was that massive asset purchase program. You probably remember the Fed buying up trillions, literally trillions of dollars in Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities.
Right, QE, quantitative easing, the idea being to push down those longer-term rates too and just keep credit flowing everywhere.
That's the textbook goal, yes. And Powell's justification, at least in this Princeton speech, according to the source, was really about the sheer shock of the situation. He used this phrase, with little warning, economies around the world came to a hard stop.
Came to a hard stop. That's pretty stark language. It really captures that feeling in early 2020.
It does. And he used that to argue the Fed's response wasn't just helpful, it was, well, essential. He apparently said something like, the possibility of a long, severe global depression was staring us in the face.
Wow. So basically, everyone looked to the government and looked to the Fed as the first responders.
That's the picture he painted.
Yeah.
That the Fed had to step in aggressively to prevent, a complete meltdown. He credited the joint efforts of many for avoiding the worst outcomes, as the source puts it.
So the core message from Powell in this speech, based on the source, was, we did what we had to do to prevent a catastrophe.
That seems to be the main thrust of his defense of the initial response. Now, the source does note, importantly, that Powell has said elsewhere they maybe could have moved quicker on inflation later on.
Okay, so acknowledging the inflation issue that came after.
Right, acknowledging that critique. But for this particular speech, the focus was really justifying those early big moves during the immediate crisis.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So that's Powell's side as presented. What about those onslaughts of attacks the source mentioned? Who's criticizing and what are they saying specifically?
Well, the source highlights two main figures. First up, President Donald Trump.
Right. The source says Trump's been hitting Powell with a stream of attacks. What's the issue there, according to the material?
It seems to be about current interest rate policy. Trump's criticism, as reported, is that the Fed hasn't cut rates this year. Remember, they did cut late last year.
Okay. So Trump thinks they should be cutting again now.
Apparently so. The source says Trump's view is that there's, quote, no inflation, and so the Fed needs to lower borrowing costs.
No inflation. That's a strong claim given the data. And the source mentions the language Trump used.
Oh, yeah. It includes quotes like calling Powell a fool for not cutting rates, and more recently nicknaming him Too Late Powell.
Wow. Okay, pretty blunt stuff. Has Powell responded?
Not directly to these specific attacks, according to the source. He tends to avoid engaging in that kind of back and forth publicly.
Okay, so that's one line of criticism. Who's the other critic the source focuses on? Kevin Warsh.
Yes, Kevin Warsh. He's a former Fed governor himself, served back from 2006 to 2011. And the source notes he's sometimes mentioned as a potential future Fed chair.
Okay, so someone with Fed experience. What's his angle? Is it the same as Trump's?
No, it's quite different. Warsh's critique, as presented in the source, seems more focused on the consequences and the nature of the Fed's interventions, especially regarding that high inflation we saw peak in 2022.
So he's looking back more at the inflation surge.
Partly, yes, but also at the broader implications. The source quotes him saying things like, each time the Fed jumps into action, the more it expands its size and scope.
Expanding its size and scope. Okay.
And he argues that more debt is accumulated, more institutional lines are crossed, and the Fed is compelled to act even more aggressively the next time.
That phrase, institutional lines are crossed. What exactly does the source suggest he means by that? It sounds significant.
It does. Based on the source material, it seems Warsh is arguing that the Fed's massive interventions, especially that huge bond buying program, kind of blurred the boundary.
Blurred the boundary between what the Fed normally does, monetary policy, and what the government does, fiscal policy, like taxing and spending.
Exactly. The source specifically says Warsh and other critics argue those bond purchases effectively enable the federal government to borrow and spend more.
Ah, okay. So the critique is that the Fed, by buying up so much government debt, made it easier for the government to run up bigger deficits, going beyond its traditional role.
That seems to be the core of that specific criticism highlighted in the source. A critique about the Fed potentially overstepping its mandate and facilitating government spending.
Interesting. Okay, so beyond defending the economic actions and these criticisms, did Powell touch on anything else significant in this Princeton speech, according to the source?
Yes, actually. The source points out he spent some time praising the people inside the Fed, the career staff.
The long-term civil servants.
Precisely. He called them career civil servants at the Fed who were veterans of previous crises. He apparently quoted them as saying, during the pandemic, "We got this."
We got this. That's quite a statement of confidence.
It is. And Powell, according to the source, said their collective efforts saved our economy and that these people deserve our respect and gratitude. He even called it his great honor to serve alongside them.
So almost like a defense of the institution itself and the people in it, maybe pushing back subtly against that climate of attack.
That's certainly how it reads in the summary provided by the source.
Yep.
Strong commendation. And then there was another interesting point, his defense of universities.
Universities. Like Princeton, where he was speaking. Why bring that up?
Well, the source connects this to actions by the Trump administration. Specifically, moves targeting research grants and funding, particularly for some Ivy League schools.
I see. So Powell stepped in to defend them.
He did. He reportedly called great universities like Princeton the envy of the world and a crucial national asset. And he urged the audience to take none of this for granted.
So the speech wasn't just narrowly about interest rates and bond buying. The source suggests he was making a broader point about sort of the value of public service, expertise, and these major institutions, the Fed, universities, in a challenging environment.
Yeah, that seems to be the takeaway the source presents. That Powell is defending not just Fed policy, but also the role of these established institutions and the professionals within them, potentially in response to broader criticisms.
Right. So wrapping this up, you shared the source material with us, and we've done this deep dive. We've seen Powell at his old university defending those really aggressive early pandemic moves, the near zero rates, the trillions in bond buying.
Arguing they were crucial to head off a potential global depression, while, as the source noted, also acknowledging maybe they were a bit slow on inflation later.
And then we looked at the criticisms the source highlighted. President Trump's attacks, focused on wanting rate cuts now, calling Powell names because he sees no inflation, and contrasted that with Kevin Warsh's critique, the worry about the Fed's expanding scope, crossing institutional lines, maybe enabling too much government spending through its actions.
And finally, we saw how the source described Powell broadening his remarks, praising those career Fed employees that we got as veterans, and making a strong case for universities as vital national assets, potentially linking that to funding challenges.
Yeah, so this look into the source you provided really gives a snapshot, doesn't it? How these key figures defend their decisions, how institutions like the Fed navigate these really sharp criticisms from both political figures and, experienced insiders like Warsh.
Absolutely, and what this source kind of leaves us thinking about, I suppose, is how institutions built for stability, like the Fed, actually operate and defend themselves when they're under such intense fire. Right. And that mention in the source of Powell defending universities, alongside the Fed, in the context of attacks on funding and expertise. Well, it might hint at a larger discussion happening right now about the public standing of expertise and major institutions generally.
So maybe the question to leave you with, thinking about the source you shared, is what really stands out to you from this specific intersection of economics, high-stakes politics, and the defense of these core institutions as it's all laid out here?